The Watership Down podcast is intended for listeners who are familiar with the plot. There may be spoilers. This episode is scripted by Newell Fisher, John Ruths and Leea Mäkelä. Hello, and welcome to the Watership Down podcast, episode 99, in which we will be looking at the fifth story from part 1 of Tales from Watership Down, chapter 5, The Hole in the Sky. First though, you may have noticed some changes in sound quality recently, as I'm trying out varying ways of recording sound that don't break the bank. I could just shell out hundreds of pounds on a mic, and I know my production values aren't, what's the expression, sky high, but I cannot justify that kind of expense on a podcast that I make no money from at all, as it is a shared effort. I just hope the sound quality isn't too distracting. My apologies if it is. I've had yet a further conversation on the subject of the lost paragraph in the novel Watership Down with an academic called Dr. Roberta Grandi on Facebook. She is a research fellow in English literature at Aosta Valley University in Italy. She directed me to an unpublished PhD dissertation by Joan Bridgman, written in 1990, called The Writing, Publication and Literary Context of Watership Down, from University College London, pages 31 to 34. To quote page 33, quote, "With leadership acknowledged as a theme, this may be better highlighted by concentrating on Bigwig as the only possible alternative, and by delaying his recognition of Hazel as leader until the end of the novel, where it comes with climactic force. Adams places a late insertion to stress and lengthen this rivalry. It is a retrospective edition after his recognition that the theme of leadership is present in the novel, and can only be placed after the novel is written." End quote. I therefore now have a different, less accidental explanation for the introduction of the lost paragraph, which I will say more about once I've done some reading. Suffice to say, my speculation previously that Penguin were accidentally sent a different draft that included the lost paragraph seems to be wrong. Including it in their edition was a deliberate editorial decision, which makes the fact that the other version survives to this day even more interesting. Thank you for that context, Roberta, and welcome to the Owsler. I'm going to be reading that dissertation with great interest. Anyway, let's meet the hole in the sky. Part 1, Chapter 5, The Hole in the Sky. Why on Frith's good earth did Hawkbit request this story as a good one to tell after Dandelion had suggested the relatively light-hearted Fox in the Water as the rabbits of Watership Down made their way to Ephrata? Well, possibly because when Richard Adams wrote Watership Down, neither story had actually been written, and the title of this story was just a title, unlike the just-started Fox in the Water that we hear being told later in the novel as Woundwort and Bigwig fight. In any case, I suppose it would have been a better choice for morale than the Black Rabbit of Inlay requested by Bigwig, but only just. It is a story of two halves, the link between the two halves not seeming very obvious, almost as if it was two partial story ideas stuck together. Appropriately for a story of two halves, there are two opening quotes. The first is from the Gospel of Matthew, specifically 25:45. It is a verse in which Jesus talks of separating people into two categories, the sheep and the goats. The sheep are those who help anyone who needed help, while the goats only help those who they regarded as worthy of help. They are cursed to eternal damnation, as by not helping all who needed help, they failed to help God. We will soon see how this quotation fits with this story. The second quotation is from the war poem Autumn 1942 by Roy Fuller, who served in the Royal Navy during the Second World War. It comes from a collection of poems called The Middle of a War, published in 1942. It seems to have been inspired by his time on an early aircraft carrier, in which he read of the wider war going on, while he would have spent a lot of his time studying the skies above his ship. At this time, Britain was under siege by the Third Reich, which had dominated mainland Europe, while the Battle of Stalingrad, surely the most shocking of the entire war, was underway. This was a battle between the Third Reich and the Soviet Union under Stalin, without whom the democracies of the West would undoubtedly have lost the war. At a time like this, Fuller seems to question whether being on the right side in such a terrible conflict can protect your virtue if you're going to have to do such terrible things and have such terrible allies in order to win. He talks of our virtues being, quote, the high and horrible ones of a streaming wound which heals in evil, end quote. A horrific image that sums up the moral confusion that can arise in the thick of war, where terrible acts of violence are supposed to be looked upon as good. The relevance of this quotation to the second horrific half of this story seems to explain what Adams may have had in mind, bearing in mind the fact that he too served in the Second World War. John Ruths adds these thoughts, quote, "Virtues being high and horrible sounds very warlike to me. High in that we must preserve and go on to win, but we also must do many horrible things to do so. Thus, the passage later talks about a wound that heals in evil. Well, that's my take on it anyway. It also harkens to the end of the chapter where Elachera and Rabscuttle go to see the Black Rabbit. Elachera did not do horrible things, but he took part in horrible, somewhat Faustian bargains, and horrible things happened to him. When they came back at the end, much time had gone by. Most of the younger rabbits of the warren had lost touch with the sacrifices that older rabbits had made in the war against King Darzin. So even having to be horrible can be oddly seen as virtuous. As a soldier, I believe I understand this, but certainly many other folks in various occupations understand the same. Sometimes you have to do some deplorable things to come out all right in the end." End quote. In the story, we are once again with Elachera the teacher and guide, as in the last story, as he visits other warrens, listening and advising. The storyteller on Watership Down, who is not introduced, comments that Elachera may even visit them on Watership Down one day, and could be hard to recognise. We, as readers of the original novel, know that this will indeed happen one day, when he comes to ask the aged Hazel to join his Owsla. Adams writes of a warren, the name of which, as well as of the rabbits from it who are named, seems to be completely unlike any other names we have encountered in Lapine, as if it were so far away that they almost have another language. The warren is called Parda Rail, and they seem to think a lot of themselves. But, we learn, the chief's doe, for example, once you got to know her, was entirely lacking in the qualities of an honest rabbit. To join this warren practically needed a personal recommendation from Prince Rainbow himself. All in all, not a nice place. One day, 2 rabbits from this warren, named Hallion and Thycon, are returning from a garden raid when they come across a Hlessi, or wandering rabbit with no warren, who is injured and in a very bad way. He begs them for help, but they refuse, saying such a rabbit would bring shame to their perfect warren. A few days later, Elachera visits the perfect warren of Parda Rail and meets with the chief rabbit, Henthred, as well as his magnificent Owsla. He asks them all in turn what they would do if they came across a poor injured Hlessi. They all say they would help him. Then, of course, Elachera transforms into the injured Hlessi who was not helped a few days before. Having done so, he confronts the 2 rabbits who left him. They attempt to defend themselves by saying they did not recognise him, but of course this is no defence, as Matthew's Gospel reminds us. The Owsla leaves in shame, leaving Elachera having delivered his simple but effective lesson, with just the chief and the oldest rabbit in the warren, named Themeron. And now the story moves somewhat abruptly into its second half, as Themeron tells Elachera that, had he come across him disguised as a poor injured Hlessi, he would have known all was not as it seemed, even if he had not known who he actually was. This is because, he says, that he would have known that this was not a rabbit who had seen the hole in the sky. Themeron refuses to elaborate and limps away. As a result, Elachera becomes obsessed with what Themeron meant by the hole in the sky, and, once he has left Parda Rail, asks everyone he can what this means, but no one can tell him. Eventually he gives up asking, and concludes that he is missing out on knowing about something wonderful. He wonders what might be on the other side of the hole in the sky. Elachera's wanderings eventually take him into some hills, where he encounters a strange, aggressive creature known as a Timbleer. It seems we are back in sense of smell territory, with oddly named creatures unfamiliar in our world. The Timbleer tells Elachera to turn back, but he refuses, so it attacks him. They fight up and down the path, and both are badly injured, the Timbleer eventually limping away, hurling insults at Elachera. Elachera is so badly injured that he cannot move from the path. He becomes delirious and lays there for a long time. In his delirium, he imagines he sees Rabscuttle, but he turns out to be a bush. And now things get really weird, as Elachera, the chief rabbit of legend for the rabbits of Watership Down, imagines he is Hazel, telling Hyzenthe to take care of the warren while he goes on wide patrol with Campion. This bending of the timeline must be a fancy of the storyteller on Watership Down, designed to compliment his chief. In his delirium he hears jokes being whispered in his ear. He eats the grass where he lies, but cannot taste it. He hears Rabscuttle tell him it will make him better. The next morning he sees a green fox on the path. He tries to stand, collapses, looks up at the sky and sees it. The hole in the sky. The description of it is horrific, as if it reveals something behind the sky that is biological and truly terrifying. It is truly the stuff of nightmarish delirium. We are in the territory of hidden, unspoken horror, of Conrad's Heart of Darkness, of Lovecraft's Cthulhu. The hole in the sky, unexpectedly, is an expression of something far, far darker than I expected. Why on earth did Hawkbit request this story when he did? As Elocherra stares in terror, a dead rabbit falls from the hole in the sky, which seems to move, to be trying to swallow up Elocherra. Is this a simple metaphor for death? In panic, Elocherra rolls down the slope, away from the path, and passes out. When he comes around, he is feeling a little better. After walking a short distance, he rests to clean himself and is visited by Lord Frith himself, who says Elocherra has done enough adventuring for now. He need do no more. He asks Frith how he can bear to have a hole in the sky exist. Frith says it does not. It was a product of Elocherra's mind. He must never speak of it again. Those who have seen it do not wish to remember it, and those who have not will not understand. A now wiser Elocherra takes this to heart, and never mentions the hole in the sky again. Is it canon? John Ruths writes, quote, "Canon has proven to be a tough question for the stories in this novel so far. Frankly, it should be with a deity or deity-like character. You could say the same about any religion, and characters like Elocherra, along with Frith, the Black Rabbit, Prince Rainbow, fall into this category. I think I lean more toward canon, and I think this is the case here. To me, this is canon. To me, many myths are true, or at least stem from real things that have happened. For example, I believe in this historical Jesus, even if science can't yet say he existed. I'm nonetheless very sceptical when I see evidence, because I also believe I'm very non-religious, and I also look for the trappings of any belief system. It has to make sense to me for me to accept it. I will always be hesitant to believe in something where the belief has fear behind it. However, even when a myth is real, it still seems to turn into that myth that lessons can be derived from. This seems to be one of the essential purposes of any religious myth, to help those who tell it now live their lives, help them in deciding what to do, and especially in matters of right and wrong. Sorry about the wordy explanation, but to me, this is canon." End quote. Leea Mäkelä writes, quote, "Hole in the Sky seems to remain in the genre of religious tale in the beginning, with Elocherra presenting himself as a wounded Hlessi that some proud Ausla members just mocked instead of recognising him. Then it takes a turn more into the realm of a horror story and ends up as some kind of morality. Not even Elocherra himself should be too proud and pick wrong fights. Now, as I first set myself that question, how different the mood or outcome of Bigwig's Ephratham adventure had been had either Fox in the Water or Hole in the Sky replaced the story of Elocherra and the Black Rabbit of Inlay, even if both existed only as names and not stories during that time, I guess I have to answer that very different. The story of Elocherra and the Black Rabbit of Inlay is a story of being brave and persistent even at the face of death and horror. Hole in the Sky is a morality of staying humble and not being too proud, and not picking fights that might end up in injuries. Fox in the Water is not quite as clear, encouraging one thing or another, but it would not have fit into that part of the larger story either. Maybe it can be read also as a story about learning to use fear as a weapon, as Elocherra projects the image of approaching hounds into the fox's head. However, even that way it fits better to where the pieces of the story are used in Watership Down, as Elocherra, who's able to project images into others' heads, is definitely closer to Fiver than Bigwig. While rereading these, I once again stopped to admire Richard Adams as a horror writer, even though he's not often credited for that. The atmosphere in both Hole in the Sky and Story of Elocherra and the Black Rabbit of Inlay is very eerie. I haven't read Plague Dogs since my teens, maybe I should sooner or later again, but I still remember best from it the part of the dog following a ghost of another dog, and how the eerie atmosphere slowly grew into more and more haunting. And I also admired that description of haunted battlefield in Shardik. Well, I do remember how I first read The Hole in the Sky as a good night story, when Tales from Watership Down was new, since the early stories in the book had definitely been more of that quality, and ended up having nightmares, even if the story hasn't quite had that strong effect on later rereadings. Well, if I remember it right, there's still some more eerie stories ahead." End quote. For my part, I come to find the concept of the hole in the sky to be a fascinating expression of what existential dread might look like for a rabbit. What else other than a vast, fleshy, horrific mouth in the sky threatening to consume you? However, overall I find this story to be a bit of a, if you'll pardon the pun, dog's dinner. As if Adams just stuck various bits of story together. More might have been made of the fact that Elefthera ends up actually in the desperate state that he begins by impersonating. It could almost have been made a story of time travel, as the rabbits of Parderail glimpse Elefthera's imminent future, caused, ironically, by their oldest rabbit having piqued his curiosity. So, for me, a bit of a missed opportunity, and overall, not canon, but with one overarching, fascinating element. Next time, we celebrate the 100th episode of the Watership Down podcast.